In late September, while every homesteader in the settlement was stacking firewood high, Christopher Reeves was doing something that looked like madness. He was peeling sheets of birch bark. His wife Sandra gathered the white sheets nearby. Her own work paused for this strange harvest.
Careful with that one. It's wide enough to cover 2 courses.
We should be chopping wood. The wind already smells like frost.
Then came the creak of a wagon and the voice of Ronald Finch.
You too, papering a house like a birch tree. That won't stop a stiff breeze, let alone a Dakota winter.
Christopher did not answer. He knelt and pressed a fresh sheet over the moss chinking of the cabin wall. A red arrow painted stark across the bark.
I've seen children build better shelters with sticks and mud. You are gambling your lives.
Let him laugh. The old ones knew what birch bark can do.
But as Ronald rode off laughing, even Sandra felt the weight of the coming cold tighten around her heart. Day after day, they peeled birch while the settlement stacked firewood.
Work with the grain, not against it. The bark gives if you ask right.
My hands are bleeding, but winter won't ask nicely.
They loaded the sled, bark sheets curling, and dragged it home through dry leaves. At the cabin, Christopher packed moss into the log chinks while Sandra held the bark ready.
The moss breathes, the bark sheds water. Together they form a skin.
All I see is the woodpile shrinking and the sky closing in.
He pinned each sheet at the top, overlapping. Water would shed, never enter. By week's end, a whole wall gleamed white. Wagons slowed, but no one offered a word. The first frost came. Sandra watched him peel another sheet. The question hung unspoken. What if they were wrong? The next afternoon, Ronald Finch returned, this time with 3 other men in tow, their laughter carrying across the clearing before their horses stopped.
Look here, boys. They're still at it. What's next, Christopher? Planting a whole birch grove so you can paper every wall.
The Ojibwe have used birch bark for centuries. It's waterproof, rot-resistant. It breathes.
Savage foolishness. You think those old ways can match a real winter? You'll freeze solid in that paper box.
Why won't they just leave? Every laugh feels like another gap in the wall.
Christopher said nothing more. He turned back to the wall and pressed another sheet into place, the red arrow stark against the white.
When the drifts swallow your door, don't expect any of us to dig you out.
The horsemen rode off, their laughter fading into the gray afternoon. But the silence they left was heavier.
3 walls, nearly done. But what if 4 walls and a roof of bark still aren't enough?
Christopher climbed the ladder with a bark sheet for the eaves. If he had doubts, he buried them under another nail. By late afternoon, the last bark sheet was tacked over the eave, sealing the roof edge against the sky.
It's finished. But so is any chance to do something normal before the snow. What if they're right? What if this is just a fancy gamble that leaves us freezing?
Birch bark has oils that repel water. It's layered like a roof shingle but lighter. It's kept northern tribes alive through worse than this.
That red arrow was more than a mark. It was a promise that this direction would hold. Then Ronald's voice cut through the cold, one last time.
You'll freeze in that paper house. First hard storm will tear it to shreds.
Christopher didn't turn. He stood beside Sandra, watching the first snowflake drift down. The snow began to fall, soft and steady, blanketing the birch bark in white. Winter had arrived, and the true test had just begun. The first real snowstorm swept down 3 nights later, howling around the bark-clad eaves like a pack of wolves. Inside the cabin, the fire burned steady. No draft crept through the walls. The air felt dry and warm. But then, a single bead of water traced down the window glass, dark against the frost-free pane.
There, a failure. Sandra, there's a leak by the window.
Sandra hurried over with a bucket of damp moss and clay mixed with pine pitch. She worked the paste into the seam under the sill until the trickle stopped.
Only a pinhole. The bark held everywhere else.
Across the clearing, the same storm found Ronald Finch's cabin. Every gust pried at the chinking. Inside, frost painted the logs, and his wife shivered under thin blankets. Ronald stuffed rags into the gaps, but the cold pried them loose. By morning, the wind had died. Christopher pushed through the snow to inspect the bark. The walls were dry, the seams tight, until he saw it.
A branch must have fallen. The tear is small, but wind could pry it open.
He called Sandra. Together they examined the gash, a jagged rip no wider than a finger.
I kept scraps. We can patch it before the next storm.
She sealed the hole with a bark scrap and fresh pine pitch, pressing it flat, then hoofbeats. Ronald approached on his sleigh, eyes scanning the wall for damage.
Already mending your paper house. See how well it held. Just a taste of what's coming.
He rode on, leaving the patch as proof. Sandra's hands fell to her sides. The bark held, but that single tear planted a deeper crack, the fear that Ronald might be right. Weeks passed. The deep cold held, but the bark-walled cabin remained dry, the fire burning steady on half the wood.
No condensation, no damp. The bark is doing exactly what he said it would.
Ronald's wife could be heard across the snow, her voice bitter. The ice inside their cabin grew thicker each night.
We've only used a third of our woodpile. Normally it would be half gone by now.
The bark traps the warmth. It's not magic. It's just old knowledge.
But Ronald, shivering in his drafty cabin, still called it luck. He refused to see the proof right across the clearing.
How much misery will it take before he swallows his pride?
The days grew shorter. In Christopher's cabin, the bark walls held the heat like a second coat. In Ronald's cabin, the logs iced over from the inside, and his wife's complaints turned to silence. But the sky was building something worse. The deadliest winter in memory was forming above them. The sky turned the color of old iron. At the trading post, men who had weathered 50 winters whispered that a killer was coming. Christopher didn't stack more firewood. He gathered pine pitch and scraps of bark to seal every seam he could find.
Every gap he seals is another promise we won't freeze tonight.
Tarring your paper boat? A real blizzard won't care how much pitch you slather on.
His laugh carried across the clearing, but this time no one joined him. Christopher moved the last logs inside the calm space between the bark walls and the door. By dusk, the first gust slammed the cabin walls. The blizzard was here. Inside, the bark held. Outside, the world disappeared into a howling white void.
The bark is warm to the touch, warmer than it should be.
The storm had begun, and there was no turning back. Inside the bark cabin, the fire crackled steady all through the first night. No draft crept through the walls.
The blizzard screams like a dying horse, but in here the air is still and dry.
Outside, the storm buried the land with a fury that turned day into night. But across the clearing, the same blizzard was tearing into Ronald Finch's cabin with vindictive force. Snow sifted in through every chink, piling like fine sand on the windowsills. Ronald fed the struggling fire, but the cold gnawed faster than the wood could burn. By midnight, frost bloomed on the inner logs, spreading like a white sickness. His wife curled around their child, her own breath visible in the darkness, unable to speak.
The bark is holding. It's holding, and it's warmer than I ever hoped.
Outside, the blizzard buried the land. Inside the two cabins, the outcome of the gamble was slowly being written. By the second day, ice thickened on Ronald's logs like a white plague. Ice crystals jutted from every seam, mocking the feeble heat. His wife wept softly, her breath misting, as the child shivered against her.
Across the clearing, they're warm, and here, my family is dying. But I can't face him.
He fed the fire, but the flames licked feebly at icy wood. His wife's sobs cut through the howl of the wind, a sound worse than the storm itself.
Pride is a poor blanket, but it's all I have left.
In Christopher's bark cabin, the fire danced, and no draft betrayed the walls. Ronald's cabin was a tomb of ice, his family huddling for a mercy only movement could bring. But pride still choked the cry before it reached his lips. On the third day, the chimney clogged with ice and the fire died. Smoke backed into the room as the embers blackened.
Another hour, and they'll be too frozen to move. Pride won't warm their hands.
He pulled his wife up, wrapped the child in the last thin blanket, and pushed into the white void. The blizzard swallowed them. He dragged his family through chest-deep drifts, ice burning his eyes, a faint amber glow the only compass. The bark cabin glowed ahead, its walls humming with trapped warmth, a lighthouse in the howling gray. He reached the door and pounded with frozen fists, a desperate beat half lost in the wind.
Christopher, it's Ronald. Please. My family.
That's Ronald, the man who swore he'd never set foot here.
Christopher crossed the room and lifted the latch. The door swung open, and the whiteout surged in. Ronald stood, his family limp behind him, frost in his beard, his eyes pleading the mercy his pride could never utter.
My cabin's a tomb. Please, my wife, my child. They can't take another hour.
He mocked our work, called it savage foolishness. Now he begs at our door, his family half frozen.
Nobody deserves to freeze, not even the man who laughed at us.
Christopher stepped aside, and the frozen family lurched into the warmth. The dry heat hit Ronald like a wall, so different from his ice-ridden cabin.
This is what birch bark does. It's warm, it's dry, and I called him a fool.
Ronald's eyes traced the birch bark walls, the red arrow still vivid, and something cold inside him began to thaw. Sandra ladled warm broth into a bowl, and Christopher fed the fire. The blizzard still howled, but inside the bark-wrapped cabin, 6 souls now clung to a fragile truce. Ronald had found shelter, but the question of whether he would find humility was just beginning. Christopher fed the fire, the flames surging higher, as the thawing family huddled close to the hearth.
How is this possible? There's no draft, no ice. My cabin, it was a block of ice.
Birch bark, the thing you called paper.
Ronald's mouth opened, then closed. No argument came. Sandra moved quietly, pressing a bowl of warm broth into the woman's trembling hands. The child gulped the broth, his small hands steadying at last.
Paper, I said, and this paper held, while my logs turned to ice.
The only sounds were the hiss of the fire and the distant shriek of the blizzard. Sandra met Christopher's eyes. They had saved their enemies, but the old words still hung like frost. Ronald knew the truth now, but whether he would ever speak it, that was another storm. By the 4th day, the blizzard had not relented. The bark cabin held its heat without needing extra wood. Inside, 6 souls shared a space never meant for so many, huddled under every blanket they owned.
The walls are holding, but this truce is as fragile as the bark. One wrong word could tear it.
The storm howled. Ronald sat against the wall, his family asleep beside him. He caught Christopher's eye.
I was wrong.
Christopher gave a slow nod. Not forgiveness, only acknowledgement.
About everything. The bark, the old ways, your stubbornness. I was wrong.
The words hung in the cramped space, heavier than any drift outside. Sandra glanced at her husband, but Christopher only stared into the flames, his silence a wall of its own. The blizzard roared on, as if the land itself was waiting to see if the confession was enough. During a brief lull in the wind, when the exhausted family slept, Ronald crossed to where Sandra sat, mending a shawl.
I should have listened. When Christopher first spoke of the old ways, I laughed. Now my family lives because of that bark.
He won't hold a grudge forever, but you'll need more than words to prove you've changed.
Ronald nodded slowly, then turned toward Christopher, sharpening his bark spud by the fire.
Christopher, teach me. I can't let my family freeze again.
Christopher set the spud down, his face unreadable.
Not now. Survive first. We'll talk when the storm ends.
Ronald's shoulders sagged, but he did not argue. He simply nodded and returned to his sleeping family. Sandra caught Christopher's eye, a small nod of approval passing between them. Outside, the blizzard resumed its fury, but inside, a seed had been planted. The blizzard intensified, and a loud crack splintered the air from the direction of Ronald's cabin.
The roof is going. If we don't go now, everything will be buried. We need to go. Blankets, tools. If the roof gives, we lose everything salvageable.
You'll die out there. The rope could snap, the cold, it's suicide.
We'll rope together. It's a risk, but I won't leave them with nothing.
They pushed into the white void, the rope their only tether to life. At the ruined cabin, they grabbed armloads of blankets, tools, a small wooden box of keepsakes. The roof groaned and sagged. They dove through the door. Just as a section collapsed behind them, they staggered back through the drifts, half blinded by snow, arms locked around the salvaged goods. They collapsed inside the bark cabin, the storm screaming louder than ever, but firelight welcomed them home. Shaking from the cold and the near miss, Ronald sank to his knees by the fire and wept openly.
You saved us twice. Once at your door, and again out there. I owe you everything.
Christopher knelt beside him, and for the first time, placed a hand on his shoulder.
When the thaw comes, I'll show you how. Everything I know.
Sandra watched, her eyes glistening. The two families, once divided, now shared a single fire.
He could have let us freeze. He chose mercy instead.
The fire danced, and the storm outside seemed to lose its edge.
He's ready. The old ways will live on.
For the first time since the blizzard began, the silence inside the bark cabin felt like peace. The deadliest winter would pass, but the lesson would remain. After 6 days, the storm broke. The sun spilled through a pale gray sky and the wind fell silent. Christopher stepped outside, his boots crunching on the crusted snow.
Sandra, the bark held, not a single leak or drop of moisture.
Sandra emerged, her breath misting, and placed her hand on the dry bark, disbelief turning to awe. Across the clearing, Ronald stood before his own cabin, a frozen tomb, icicles hanging from shattered rafters. The contrast was brutal. One cabin stood dry and intact. The other was a wreck of ice and collapsed logs. Other homesteaders, emerging from their snowbound shelters, drifted toward the clearing, drawn by the strange sight. They touched the bark walls in wonder, their murmurs carrying across the snow. Christopher stood apart, allowing the proof to speak. The man who had been mocked for papering his house had weathered the deadliest winter in memory. The next morning, Christopher led Ronald into the birch grove, the spud and mallet in his hand.
Choose a tree with smooth bark. No deep cracks. The best sheets come from the south-facing side.
Ronald's frostbitten fingers fumbled with the spud, the tool clumsy in his stiff grip.
Go slow. Let the bark lift at its own pace.
My hands are useless, but I won't stop. Not after everything.
Christopher's steady hands closed over Ronald's, guiding the spud into the bark at the perfect angle. With a soft crackle, the bark loosened. Ronald eased it away in one unbroken sheet.
It's perfect. No tears, no splits, just like you said.
That sheet will cover a gap twice its size. Now you know.
Ronald held his first sheet, the white surface catching the light, a silent proof that the old wisdom was now his own. The spring melt came hard, but Christopher's cabin stood bone dry. No moisture had breached the bark. Ronald spent every spare hour in the birch grove, his once mocking hands now steady with purpose. At his own half-built cabin, he pressed a fresh sheet against the logs. On it, a vivid red arrow, just like Christopher's. The same neighbors who once jeered now paused to watch. Some brought charcoal and slate, taking notes. One man approached Christopher, his voice hesitant but earnest.
Could you show us? Show us how it's done?
Christopher only nodded and handed the man his spare spud.
Look at him. The man who mocked is now the second teacher.
Week by week, the settlement transformed. Cabins once bare now gleamed with birch bark, each bearing a red arrow. The man who had mocked papering a house was now peeling bark of his own and teaching others to do the same. On a quiet spring day, Christopher and Sandra walked along a thawing stream, the meltwater singing over the stones. Behind them, their bark-clad cabin stood unchanged by the brutal winter, a testament to old wisdom.
No words needed now. The sun says everything.
Across the clearing, Ronald's family was finishing their own bark wrapping, the red arrow bright on the fresh sheet.
Even Ronald's hands, once clumsy with pride, now moved with the confidence of someone who had learned.
The old ways endure, not just in bark, but in the hearts that learn.
The valley was no longer just a collection of cabins. It was a community bound by the lesson of the birch. Birds returned, building nests under the eaves of bark-clad roofs. A single birch leaf unfurled, green and fragile, like the trust that had grown between former enemies. And Christopher, weathered and quiet, watched it all with a peace he had earned. Wide final shot of the valley. 2 cabins, both clad in birch bark, stand among green pines, the bark catching the golden light of late afternoon. Sometimes survival isn't about force, but about listening to the old wisdom. In the end, the same winter that nearly killed them left behind a strange new tradition, one that began with peeling bark. Christopher, weathered and quiet, watched it all with a peace he had earned. And in that quiet valley, the birch stood testament to a truth as old as the forest. The strongest shelter is not built with force, but with patience and the wisdom of the land. And the man who was mocked became the teacher of those who once laughed. For the bark endures, and so does the spirit that learned to trust it. The deadliest winter had passed, but its lesson would shelter generations.